The first thing Henry McCallum noticed was the sound, not the eerie stillness of the forest blanketed in snow, or the occasional rustle of frostbitten branches, but an otherworldly hum, sharp, resonant, and undeniably alien. It wasn't his first rodeo with strange noises, but in all his 73 years, 40 of which were spent either surviving or actively antagonizing interstellar predators, he'd never heard anything quite like it. The old man tugged his fur-lined hat lower over his ears, his breath misting in the frigid air. Snowflakes clung stubbornly to his beard, a mess of white that blended seamlessly into the endless expanse of the frozen landscape. The trap was just ahead. He could see it through the trees, a crude mesh of reinforced synth steel cables glowing faintly under the moonlight, and inside the trap, well, that was what was making the noise. Henry squinted. Of all the stupid ideas, he muttered under his breath, shuffling forward. His knees ached, but he ignored them. Pain was just another companion in the long, lonely journey of his life, like his worn-out coat or the patched-up plasma rifle slung over his shoulder. The creature inside the trap was illuminated by its own bioluminescence, glowing patterns of cyan and white coursing across sleek, sinuous limbs. It was unlike anything Henry had ever seen, and that was saying something. Its form was vaguely reptilian, but it moved with a fluid grace that spoke of intelligence. Its eyes, large and glowing, locked onto him as he approached. And despite every instinct honed by decades of combat, he didn't feel fear. He felt curiosity, and maybe a little irritation. The thing was caught in his trap, after all. His trap. "All right, you oversized glow stick," he muttered, crouching down a few feet from the edge of the trap. "You're either the dumbest apex predator in the galaxy, or I'm losing my touch." The creature hissed, a low, resonant sound that reverberated in Henry's chest. He winced but didn't back away. Instead, he tapped the edge of the trap with the butt of his rifle. The mesh sparked faintly in response, its energy field shimmering for a brief moment before settling. Yeah, I know you're pissed," Henry said, his voice gruff but steady. "You think I like wasting a perfectly good trap on your shiny hide? This thing's supposed to catch razorbacks, not whatever you are." The creature tilted its head, the glow of its patterns shifting in what seemed like a deliberate rhythm. Henry frowned. Was it trying to communicate? That thought was both fascinating and deeply concerning. "Great," he muttered. "Not only are you stuck, but you're smart. Just my luck." For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest was silent except for the faint hum of the trap and the distant howl of the wind. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the creature lunged against the mesh, its bioluminescence flaring brightly. The trap held, but just barely. Henry instinctively took a step back, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Whoa there, Sparky!" he barked. "I don't care how tough you are. That thing'll fry you if you push it too hard." The creature stopped, its head lowering slightly. Its glowing eyes narrowed, and for a moment Henry could have sworn it was studying him, judging him. Yeah, I get it," he said, sighing. "You're not happy? Join the club." Henry glanced at the controls on the side of the trap. They were simple enough, just a few buttons and a small display showing the status of the energy field. He could deactivate it with a single press. But should he? His mind raced. He didn't know what this thing was or where it came from. For all he knew, it was a scout for some alien invasion force, here to pave the way for an armada of glowing murder machines. Or maybe it was just a lost predator, caught in a bad situation. Either way, releasing it could be a mistake, a big mistake. But then Henry looked into its eyes again, and he saw something he didn't expect. Fear. Not the wild, thrashing fear of a trapped animal, but a deep, quiet terror. It reminded him of the young recruits he used to train, the ones who'd never seen combat before, the ones who didn't know if they'd make it home. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He unslung his rifle and set it down in the snow. The creature tensed but didn't move. Slowly, carefully, Henry pulled a small tool from his coat, a simple multi-tool with a plasma cutter attachment. He approached the trap, his movements deliberate. "All right, listen up, glow stick," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "I'm gonna get you out of there, but if you try anything funny, anything at all, I'll put you down faster than you can blink. Got it?" The creature blinked once. Slowly, Henry chose to interpret that as agreement. moment. With a steady hand, he deactivated the energy field. The mesh sagged slightly, its glow fading to nothing. The creature didn't move at first, its glowing eyes fixed on Henry. Then, with a sudden fluid motion, it stepped out of the trap. Henry tensed, his hand hovering near his rifle, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost grateful. "Well, I'll be damned," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just smart, you've got manners." The creature made a soft, chittering sound, almost like a laugh. Henry wasn't sure whether to be amused or alarmed. "All right, glow stick," he said, picking up his rifle. "You're free. Go on. Get out of here. And don't let me catch you in one of my traps again. You hear me?" The creature didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head, its glowing patterns shifting again. Henry frowned. "Do you want me to follow you now?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Sure, why not? It's not like I've got anything better to do." To his surprise, the creature started walking, not away, but toward him. It stopped a few feet away and looked at him expectantly. "Great," Henry muttered. "Just great. I saved the damn thing's life, and now I'm its new best friend." Despite his grumbling, he found himself following the creature. It led him deeper into the forest, its bioluminescence casting an eerie but oddly beautiful glow on the snow. Henry couldn't help but wonder where it was taking him, and why. As they walked, he noticed something strange. The creature's patterns were changing, shifting in ways that seemed almost deliberate. It wasn't just glowing, it was communicating. He didn't understand what it was saying, but he had a feeling it was important. "All right, glow stick," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's see where this goes." They continued through the forest, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow under Henry's boots and the faint hum of the creature's bioluminescence. Whatever was waiting for them, Henry had a feeling it was just the beginning, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost. Curiosity, maybe even hope. Henry McCallum wasn't a man easily impressed. He'd fought off Scorn raiders, outsmarted an AI uprising on Callista 5, and survived 5 near-death experiences just trying to cook bacon in zero gravity. Yet as he trudged after the glowing alien deeper into the forest, he found himself in an unusual state, intrigued. The creature moved with an unnerving combination of purpose and grace, its bioluminescent patterns pulsing in rhythmic waves. They reminded Henry of those old Earth EEG monitors, the kind he'd been hooked up to a few times when the military doctors wanted to check if he had a brain, or at least one worth saving. And just like back then, he had no clue what the readout meant. "What's your plan, Glowstick?" Henry muttered, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "Because if you're leading me into a trap, I'm not going to be thrilled. And by not thrilled, I mean I'll shoot first and regret it later." The creature, naturally, didn't respond. It just kept moving, its tail slicing through the air with a faint whoosh. Snow crunched beneath Henry's boots as he followed, his rifle slung loosely over his shoulder, but ready to fire at a moment's notice. He wasn't an idiot, whatever this thing was. It was fast, and he had no delusions about coming out on top in a straight fight. But he'd learned a thing or two in his time, and one of those lessons was simple. Don't waste ammo unless you're sure it'll make a difference. They walked for what felt like hours, though Henry's internal clock told him it had only been about 20 minutes. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that usually meant something bigger and meaner was nearby. Henry's instincts were screaming at him to turn around, but something about the creature's demeanor kept him moving forward. It didn't seem hostile, at least not yet. And if he was being honest with himself, a rare occurrence, he was curious, maybe even hopeful. That hope, however, was short-lived. The clearing appeared suddenly, like stepping through a doorway into another world. The trees gave way to an open space, bathed in the harsh blue-white light of a hovering drone, its angular form casting long shadows across the snow. Beneath it, the ground was scorched black in a perfect circle, steam rising from the frozen earth where the heat had melted through the frost. And in the center of the circle, half buried in the dirt, was a ship, or what was left of one. Henry stopped dead in his tracks. Well, crap. The creature turned to face him, its glowing patterns shifting in what Henry could only describe as agitation. It made a low, chittering sound, then looked back at the wreckage. Henry followed its gaze, squinting against the drone's light. The ship was small, sleek, and undeniably alien, its hull marred by jagged tears and scorch marks. A faint hiss of escaping gas filled the air, punctuated by the occasional pop of cooling metal. "Let me guess," Henry said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's your ride?" The creature didn't respond, obviously, but its posture said enough. It stepped forward cautiously, its movements less fluid now, as if the sight of the wreck had drained some of its confidence. Henry hesitated, then followed, his rifle at the ready. Up close, the ship was even more of a mess. One of the wings, if you could call them that, had been sheared clean off, and the cockpit canopy was shattered, the jagged edges glittering like ice in the drone's light. But it wasn't the damage that caught Henry's attention, it was the markings. The hull was covered in symbols, etched into the metal with a precision that spoke of advanced technology. They glowed faintly, not unlike the patterns on the creature's skin, but their meaning was a mystery. Henry frowned, running a gloved hand over one of the symbols. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The creature made another chittering sound, more urgent this time. It gestured with one clawed hand, pointing toward the cockpit. Henry followed its gaze and froze. Inside the shattered canopy, slumped against the control panel, was another creature. This one wasn't moving. "Ah, hell!" Henry said, stepping back instinctively. "You've got to be kidding me!" The glowing creature moved to the wreckage, its movements frantic now. It reached into the cockpit, pulling at the debris with surprising strength. Henry watched, torn between curiosity and the gnawing sense that he was getting in way over his head. "Look, buddy," he said cautiously. "I don't know if you noticed, but your friend there, they're not looking so hot." The creature ignored him, its focus entirely on clearing the debris. It let out a high-pitched trill, the sound sharp enough to make Henry wince. All right, calm down," Henry muttered, rubbing his temples. "You're going to give me a damn migraine." Against his better judgment, he moved closer. The creature was struggling with a particularly large piece of metal, its claws scratching uselessly against the surface. Henry sighed. "Fine," he grumbled. "But if this thing wakes up and tries to eat me, I'm blaming you." He slung his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed the edge of the debris, bracing his boots against the wreckage. With a grunt, he heaved, the metal groaning in protest, before finally giving way. The creature let out a sound that might have been gratitude, then scrambled into the cockpit. Henry watched as it inspected the other alien, its glowing patterns flickering erratically. The injured creature was similar in appearance but smaller, its bioluminescence dim and flickering like a dying light bulb. Henry couldn't tell if it was breathing, assuming it breathed at all. "Well, this is a fine mess," he muttered, leaning against the wreckage. "I came out here to trap razorbacks, and now I'm playing paramedic for the galaxy's weirdest light show." The glowing creature turned to him, its patterns shifting rapidly. It gestured toward the injured alien, then at Henry, its movements almost frantic. "Whoa, hold on," Henry said, holding up his hands. "I'm not a doctor. Hell, I'm barely qualified to patch up my own sorry hide." The creature didn't seem to care. It gestured again, more insistently this time. Henry groaned. "All right, fine," he said, stepping forward. "But if this thing explodes or something, I'm going to be real upset." He climbed onto the wreckage, his boots slipping on the icy metal. The cockpit was cramped, and the injured alien was slumped awkwardly against the controls. Henry reached out cautiously, his gloved hand hovering over what he assumed was its chest. "Okay," he muttered. "Let's see if you've got a pulse." He pressed his hand against the alien's skin, if it could even be called that. It was cool to the touch, its surface smooth and faintly textured, like polished stone. Henry frowned, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, the injured alien's eyes snapped open. "Holy!" Henry yelped, nearly falling backward. The creature let out a weak trill, its glowing eyes locking onto him. For a moment, Henry was too startled to move. Then slowly he raised his hands. "Easy there, buddy," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." The injured alien made a soft, warbling sound, its bioluminescence flickering weakly. The other creature responded with a series of sharp trills, its patterns shifting in what Henry could only assume was some kind of language. "Great," Henry muttered. "Now you're having a conversation. That's just fantastic." As the two aliens communicated, Henry's gaze drifted to the control panel. It was cracked and sparking, but one of the displays was still active. Strange symbols scrolled across the screen, accompanied by a series of warning tones. "Well, that doesn't look good," he said, leaning closer. "What's the problem now?" The glowing creature turned to him, its patterns shifting urgently. It pointed at the display, then at the injured alien, then back at the display. "Let me guess," Henry said. "Something's broken, and you need me to fix it, because of course you do." The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes unblinking. Henry sighed. "All right, let's take a look." He examined the control panel, his fingers brushing over the cracked surface. Most of the symbols were meaningless to him, but one thing was clear. The ship wasn't just damaged. It was leaking something bad. "Is this fuel?" he asked, glancing at the creature. It responded with a series of sharp clicks, its patterns flaring brightly. Henry didn't need a translator to know that was a yes. "Well, that's just peachy," he said. "You've got a busted ship, a leaking fuel tank, and a half-dead co-pilot. Anything else I should know?" The creature made a soft, almost sheepish sound. Henry groaned. "Of course there is," he muttered. "There's always more." Before he could ask what else was wrong, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the forest. Henry froze. That wasn't natural. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. The glowing creature's patterns shifted rapidly, its posture tense. The injured alien let out a weak trill, its eyes darting toward the forest. Henry followed their gaze, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of snow underfoot. Whatever was coming, it was big. Henry's grip tightened on his rifle. "All right, glowstick," he said, his voice low. "If you've got any bright ideas, now's the time." The creature didn't respond. It just stared into the darkness, its glowing patterns flickering like a warning beacon, and then, out of the shadows, they appeared. Henry McCallum had seen his fair share of monsters. Some had scales, others wore badges, and a few came wrapped in bureaucratic red tape that was far harder to escape than any bear trap. But as the hulking figures emerged from the darkness, towering over the wreckage with deliberate, menacing strides, Henry realized he might be looking at something far worse than any of those. The first thing he noticed was the size. These things were big, at least 8 feet tall, their frames bristling with a strange, biomechanical armor that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were hidden behind helmets shaped like predatory skulls, with glowing slits for eyes that burned a malevolent red. They moved in unison, a cold efficiency that screamed military. And judging by the heavy weapons strapped to their backs, they weren't here to hand out cookies. "Well," Henry muttered, gripping his rifle a little tighter. "Looks like the welcoming committee brought backup." The glowing alien, his new enigmatic companion, let out a sharp trill, its bioluminescent patterns flaring wildly. The injured one in the cockpit made a weak sound in response, its light flickering like a dying ember. Henry didn't need to speak their language to get the message. These newcomers weren't friends. One of the figures stepped forward, its boots crunching through the snow with a deliberate slowness that made Henry's skin crawl. It raised an arm, and a small drone detached from its shoulder, hovering forward with a faint hum. The drone scanned the wreckage, its light passing over Henry, the glowing alien, and the injured one. Henry shifted uncomfortably. He'd been in plenty of tight spots before, but this felt different. These guys didn't look like the kind of mercenaries you could scare off with a well-placed shot, or a bluff about reinforcements. They looked like professionals. Worse, they looked patient. The lead figure finally spoke, its voice a distorted growl that crackled through some kind of translator. "Surrender the asset." Henry blinked. "The asset? You mean glow stick here?" He gestured vaguely at the glowing alien, who was now crouched protectively in front of its injured companion. "Yeah, I don't think that's happening." The figure tilted its head, as if considering Henry's response. Then it stepped forward again, its weapon, a sleek, angular thing that looked like it could punch a hole through a tank, shifting slightly in its grip. "You misunderstand," it said. "This is not a negotiation." Henry sighed, muttering under his breath. "Why is it never a negotiation? Just once, I'd like to meet someone who starts with a nice chat, and maybe a cup of coffee." The glowing alien made a sharp, warbling sound, snapping Henry out of his thoughts. It was looking at him now, its patterns shifting in a way that almost seemed pleading. Henry frowned. Whatever this thing was, it didn't want to go with these guys. And while he didn't have the full picture, he'd been around long enough to recognize bad news when it showed up with a glowing gun and an attitude. All right, he grumbled, raising his rifle. "Looks like we're doing this the hard way." The lead figure didn't hesitate. It raised its weapon, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Henry thought he'd made a mistake. But before it could fire, the glowing alien sprang into action. With a burst of speed that was almost too fast to follow, it lunged at the figure, its claws raking across the armor with a screech that set Henry's teeth on edge. "Guess that's my cue," Henry muttered, diving behind a chunk of the wreckage as all hell broke loose. The clearing erupted into chaos. The mercenaries opened fire, their weapons spitting bolts of energy that lit up the night like a deadly fireworks display. Henry peeked out from behind his cover, squeezing off a few shots with his rifle. One of the bolts caught a mercenary in the shoulder, sending it staggering back, but the thing barely flinched. "Of course they're armored," Henry muttered, ducking back as a blast hit the wreckage, showering him with sparks. "Because why wouldn't they be?" The glowing alien was holding its own, darting between the mercenaries with a fluid grace that made Henry's joints ache just watching it. Its claws flashed in the dim light, cutting through armor and circuitry alike, but it was clear this wasn't a fight it could win alone. The injured alien in the cockpit let out a weak trill, drawing Henry's attention. He glanced back, his mind racing. The ship was useless, too damaged to fly, but maybe, just maybe, there was something inside that could level the playing field. "Hang tight, glowstick," he called out, scrambling toward the wreckage. "I've got a really bad idea." The cockpit was a mess, wires and panels hanging loose, but Henry's eyes were drawn to a compartment near the back. It was locked, the display glowing faintly with alien symbols, but a quick jab with his multi-tool had it open in seconds. Inside was a device, small, cylindrical, and humming with a faint blue light. "Well, hello there," Henry muttered, grabbing the device. He didn't know what it was, but if the glowing alien's frantic trills were any indication, it was important. He shoved the device into his pack and turned back to the fight. The glowing alien was still holding its ground, but it was clearly outnumbered. The lead mercenary had switched tactics, pulling out a smaller, more precise weapon that looked disturbingly like a cattle prod. Henry raised his rifle, taking aim at the lead mercenary. "Hey, ugly!" he shouted. "Over here!" The mercenary turned just as Henry fired, the shot hitting it square in the chest. The impact sent it stumbling back, giving the glowing alien an opening to lunge forward and knock the weapon out of its hands. Henry grinned. Not bad for an old man. His grin faded as he heard a low, ominous rumble behind him. He turned slowly, his heart sinking as he saw another group of mercenaries emerging from the tree line, their weapons already raised. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. The glowing alien let out a sharp trill, and for a moment Henry thought it was retreating. Instead, it darted toward him, grabbing his pack with surprising strength and yanking him toward the forest. "Hey, watch the merchandise!" he shouted, stumbling after it. The injured alien let out a weak trill from the cockpit, and Henry hesitated, glancing back. The glowing alien made an urgent sound, tugging at his arm. All right, he snapped. "I'm coming!" They disappeared into the forest, the sounds of the mercenaries' pursuit growing fainter with each step. Henry's legs burned, his lungs screaming for air, but he didn't stop. The glowing alien moved ahead of him, its patterns pulsing like a beacon, guiding him through the darkness. Finally, they stopped in a small, sheltered clearing. Henry collapsed against a tree, panting. "Next time," he wheezed, "you can carry me." The glowing alien ignored him, its attention focused on the device in his pack. It reached for it, but Henry held up a hand. "Hold on," he said. "Before you go pushing buttons, maybe you could tell me what this thing is. You know, in your glowy chirpy way. The alien tilted its head, its patterns shifting. It made a series of soft musical sounds, its claws tracing a symbol in the snow. Henry stared at it, his mind working overtime to connect the dots. "It's a signal," he said slowly. "This thing sends a signal." The alien's patterns flared brightly, and Henry groaned. "Let me guess. It calls for help, or a ride, or, God help me, it's a bomb, isn't it?" The alien didn't respond, but its urgency was clear. Henry sighed, pulling the device out of his pack. "All right," he said. "Let's see what this thing can do." He activated the device, and a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The light from the device grew brighter, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Henry's gut told him this was either the best decision he'd ever made or the dumbest. Before he could decide which, the rumble of engines filled the air. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat as a massive ship descended through the clouds, its sleek, angular form bristling with weapons. "Great," he muttered. "More company." The glowing alien stepped forward, its patterns flaring brightly. The ship hovered above them, a hatch opening on its underside. A figure stepped out, its form obscured by the blinding light. Henry squinted, his grip tightening on his rifle. "All right, glow stick," he said. "This better be a friend of yours." The alien didn't respond, its attention fixed on the descending figure. Henry's gut churned as the figure landed gracefully in the snow, its glowing eyes locking onto him. "McCallum," it said, its voice smooth and cold. "We've been looking for you." The figure's glowing eyes locked onto Henry with a predatory stillness that felt like the barrel of a gun pressed to his temple. It had spoken his name, not in the garbled cadence of translation software, but with an unsettling familiarity, like it had been rehearsing the moment for years. McCallum tightened his grip on the rifle, his fingers itching toward the trigger. He hated being recognized. Nothing good ever came of it. "Funny," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. "I don't recall RSVPing to this little reunion." The figure stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath its boots. The glowing alien beside Henry hissed, its bioluminescent patterns flaring wildly. It positioned itself protectively in front of him, as if shielding him from a threat he couldn't yet comprehend. "I have no quarrel with you, veteran," the figure said, voice smooth and unhurried. "Hand over the device, and I will allow you to walk away." Henry snorted, gesturing vaguely at the towering mercenaries circling them. "Yeah, real convincing. You've got a whole damn army, and I'm supposed to believe you'll just let me stroll out of here." The figure tilted its head, a faint mechanical whir accompanying the motion. "The device is not yours to protect. It belongs to the hierarchs." "Hierarchs?" Henry asked, narrowing his eyes. "Never heard of them, but I'm guessing they're not exactly the share and share alike type." The glowing alien hissed again, louder this time, as if it understood exactly who the hierarchs were and wanted no part of them. Henry glanced at it, his gut churning. He didn't need the full story to know one thing for certain. If this mysterious figure got its hands on the device, the galaxy was going to regret it. "Well, here's the thing," Henry said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder with deliberate nonchalance. "I didn't go through all this trouble just to hand over some fancy space doodad to the first spooky cosplayer who shows up with a posse. So how about you and your pals back off before I do something reckless?" The figure didn't flinch. "You cannot begin to comprehend what you are interfering with." "Oh, I comprehend just fine," Henry shot back. "You want the shiny thing? I don't want to give it to you. Seems pretty straightforward." The mercenaries moved closer, their weapons humming ominously. Henry tensed, calculating his odds, which were shrinking faster than his patience. The glowing alien suddenly let out a sharp, trilling cry, its patterns shifting in an urgent rhythm. Henry turned to it, frowning. "What's that supposed to mean?" he muttered. "Is this your big plan? Morse code me out of this mess." The alien pointed at the device in Henry's pack, then at the descending ship behind the figure. Its movements were frantic, almost pleading. "Oh, no," Henry said, taking a step back. "If you think I'm about to fire up some alien doohickey without knowing what it does, you've got another thing coming." The alien chittered, reaching for the pack. Henry swatted its claw away, glaring. "Hey, hands off! I haven't survived this long by pressing random buttons." The figure raised a hand, and the mercenaries stopped, their weapons trained on Henry. "The device must not be activated. You do not understand the consequences." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, funny. coming from the guy who was just about to kill me for it. The glowing alien let out another trill, this one sharper, more urgent. Henry glanced at it, then at the device, his mind racing. Whatever this thing was, it was more than just a signal or a piece of tech. It was leverage, and Henry McCallum had always been good at turning leverage into survival. He unslung his rifle, holding it loosely in one hand. "All right," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You want the device? Come and get it." Before the figure could respond, Henry hurled the rifle into the air. The mercenaries' heads snapped upward, their weapons tracking the motion instinctively. In that split second of distraction, Henry grabbed the device from his pack and slammed his hand onto its surface. The hum from the device grew louder, resonating through the clearing like the heartbeat of a giant. The glowing alien let out a piercing trill, its patterns flaring so brightly that Henry had to shield his eyes. The figure lunged toward him, its arm outstretched, but it was too late. The device activated with a deafening crack, sending a shockwave rippling through the air. The mercenaries staggered, their weapons shorting out in bursts of sparks. The figure froze mid-step, its body trembling as if caught in an invisible vise. "Okay," Henry muttered, clutching the device as it pulsed in his hands. "That was probably a bad idea." The glowing alien stepped forward, its movements deliberate. It placed a clawed hand on the device, its patterns shifting in a hypnotic rhythm. Henry watched, heart pounding, as the alien's bioluminescence seemed to merge with the device, the two glowing in perfect harmony. The figure let out a distorted growl, its voice laced with fury. "You have no idea what you've done." "Yeah, well," Henry said, taking a step back. "I get the feeling neither do you." The device emitted a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through Henry's bones. The ship hovering above them suddenly shuddered, its lights flickering. The figure turned toward it, its glowing eyes narrowing. "No!" it hissed. "You cannot." Before it could finish, the device released another shockwave, this one brighter and more focused. The ship above them groaned as its engines failed, sending it crashing into the forest with a deafening roar. Henry ducked as debris rained down, the ground shaking beneath his feet. When the dust settled, the clearing was eerily silent. The mercenaries lay motionless, their armor smoking. The figure had collapsed to its knees, its glowing eyes dim. The glowing alien turned to Henry, its patterns shifting in what he could only describe as relief. It placed the device back in his hands, its bioluminescence fading slightly. "Okay," Henry said, his voice shaky. "What now? We just walk away?" The alien tilted its head, then pointed at the device. Henry frowned. "You want me to keep this?" It chittered softly, its tone almost amused. Henry sighed, shoving the device back into his pack. "Fine, but if this thing turns out to be a galactic bug zapper, I'm blaming you." The alien made a sound that might have been a laugh, then turned toward the forest. Henry followed, his legs feeling like lead. As they disappeared into the trees, he glanced back at the wreckage. The figure was still kneeling, its head bowed. For a moment, Henry felt a twinge of something, pity, maybe. But then he shook his head. "Should have brought coffee," he muttered. The glowing alien glanced at him, its patterns shifting in what he was starting to recognize as sarcasm. Henry smirked. Yeah, laugh it up. Glow stick. Let's just hope whatever's next involves fewer explosions." And with that, they vanished into the forest, leaving the wreckage and the past behind. Back at his cabin, Henry sat by the fire, the device resting on the table. The glowing alien watched him from across the room, its patterns calm and steady. "Well," Henry said, leaning back in his chair, "guess I've got a new paperweight." The alien tilted its head, and for the first time, Henry swore it smiled. Henry stared at the alien across the cabin, its glowing patterns flickering faintly in the dim firelight. The device, innocuous and humming softly on the table, seemed smaller now, like an ordinary trinket instead of the universe-bending contraption that had nearly cost him his life. But the weight of its significance hadn't shrunk one bit. If anything, it pressed down on him harder now, like the tail end of a storm when all you want is to collapse but can't. All right, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Glow stick, let's settle this. What exactly does this thing do, huh? And don't give me the cryptic shimmer routine. I'm too old for riddles. The alien tilted its head, its bioluminescence pulsing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then, as if making a decision, it reached toward the device, its claw hovering over the surface. With a soft click, the alien pressed a hidden panel, and the humming stopped. The cabin went silent, save for the crackling of the fire. A holographic projection burst from the device, illuminating the room in vivid detail. It showed a sprawling network of interconnected nodes, planets, stars, and stations, all linked by shimmering threads of light. At the center was a pulsing red sphere, ominous and alive, tendrils reaching outward like veins. "What the hell is that?" Henry asked, leaning forward. The alien gestured to the red sphere, then to itself, then to Henry, its patterns dimming as if in sadness. Henry frowned, piecing it together. "That thing," he said slowly, "is your home, isn't it? Or was?" The alien's light flickered in affirmation. Henry exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "And I'm guessing these hierarchs aren't just some local neighborhood bullies. They're tied to this thing too, aren't they?" The alien nodded again, this time more slowly. It pointed to the shimmering threads linking the red sphere to the rest of the network. Henry squinted, his brain working overtime. "Wait," he muttered. "These connections, they're resources, aren't they? Energy, trade routes, supply chains. The hierarchs are leeching off of your planet, draining it dry." The alien's patterns flared sharply, angry, but not at him. Henry shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Figures. Big bads show up, take what they want and leave a trail of corpses in their wake. I've seen that story before." But the alien wasn't finished. It gestured to the device, then back to the network, its claws tracing a path through the threads. Henry's stomach sank as realization hit. "You're telling me this thing can sever those connections," he said. "Shut them down. Cut off the hierarch's control." The alien's light flared in agreement. "Okay," Henry said, sitting up straighter. "So what's the catch?" The alien hesitated, then gestured toward the red sphere again. Its patterns dimmed, flickering weakly. Henry's mouth went dry. "Oh, it's a one-way ticket, isn't it? Severing those threads wipes them out, but it takes your planet with it." The alien didn't move. It didn't need to. The silence said it all. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the device now, heavier than any weapon he'd ever held. This wasn't just a lever to pull, it was the lever, a switch that could rewrite the balance of power in the galaxy, but at a cost so steep it made him sick to think about it. And yet, wasn't this what he'd fought for? What he'd survived for? To protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to stand against the bastards who thought they could take and never pay the price. The alien made a soft, trilling sound, snapping Henry out of his thoughts. It gestured to the device, then to him, its patterns shifting in what looked like trust. Henry blinked. "You want me to decide why? You're the one who—" But the alien interrupted with a single sharp trill, pointing at him with a claw that left no room for argument. Henry stared at it, his heart pounding. "All right," he muttered. "You want a decision? Fine." He picked up the device, its weight almost unbearable now. The hologram shimmered, showing the red sphere pulsing angrily at the center of the network. The threads linking it to the galaxy pulsed too, a lifeline as much as a leash. "Let's see how the big bads like it when the tables turn," he growled. With a deliberate motion, he pressed the device's activation panel. The hologram shifted, the threads snapping one by one as the device unleashed its power. The red sphere began to collapse, its tendrils retracting as if in pain. Henry could feel the energy in the air, a raw, electric charge that made his teeth ache. The alien watched in silence, its patterns steady. There was no fear, no hesitation, only acceptance. As the last thread snapped, the device emitted a final, blinding pulse of light. Henry shielded his eyes, the heat searing against his skin. When it faded, the hologram was gone, and the device was dark. The alien let out a soft, mournful trill, its patterns dimming. Henry sat back, his hands trembling. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien nodded, its light flickering faintly. The network was gone, the hierarch's control was shattered, but so was the alien's home. Henry exhaled, the weight of what he'd he'd done settling in his chest like a stone. He looked at the alien, its light so faint now it was barely visible. "You're staying, aren't you?" he asked. The alien tilted its head, its patterns shifting in a way that felt grateful. It pointed to the stars, then to Henry, then back to itself. "Yeah," Henry muttered, rubbing his face. "I get it. You've got your own fight to finish." The alien stepped forward, placing a clawed hand on his shoulder. Its patterns flared one last time, a soft, warm glow that felt like a goodbye. Henry watched as it turned and disappeared into the forest, its light fading into the darkness. He sat there for a long time, the device cold and lifeless in his hands. Finally, he stood, slinging his pack over his shoulder. The fire in the cabin had burned down to embers, but he didn't bother stoking it. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. As he stepped outside, the stars above him seemed a little brighter, and for the first time in a long while, Henry McCallum felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. The galaxy would never know his name, and that was fine by him. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a man who'd done what he could, when it mattered, and that was enough. The end.